God's purpose in our loneliness. C.S. Lewis, one of the most profound Christian thinkers of the 20th century, often spoke about the challenges we face in our spiritual journeys. One such challenge is the deep, sometimes overwhelming, sense of loneliness that we all encounter at different points in our lives. Lewis believed that this loneliness, far from being a sign of abandonment, could actually be a deliberate act of God, a way for Him to set us apart so that we might grow and come to a clearer understanding of His intentions for our lives. Imagine, if you will, a master artist working on a block of stone. To the untrained eye, the stone might seem like just a rough, unremarkable piece of rock. But to the artist, it holds potential that can only be realized through careful, deliberate work. The artist chips away at the stone, removing all that is unnecessary, until a beautiful sculpture emerges. This process is not quick, and it is certainly not easy. It requires patience, precision, and a clear vision of the final outcome. Lewis compared God's work in our lives to that of a sculptor. When we feel isolated, when we feel like the world has turned its back on us, it may be that God is setting us apart for a specific purpose. In these moments of solitude, God is at work, chipping away at the rough edges of our character, removing the distractions and excesses that keep us from becoming the person He has designed us to be. It is a process of refinement, of transformation, a process that is necessary if we are to fulfill our true potential. The loneliness we experience is not without meaning. It is a tool that God uses to draw us closer to Him, to deepen our understanding of His will, and to strengthen our faith. When we are surrounded by the noise and busyness of life, it can be difficult to hear God's voice. Our attention is divided, our focus is scattered, and our spiritual growth is stunted. But when we are alone, when all distractions are stripped away, we are left with nothing but God. It is in this solitude that we can truly listen to Him, that we can reflect on our lives and seek His guidance. This concept can be difficult to accept, especially when we are in the midst of loneliness. It's natural to feel abandoned, to wonder why God would allow us to go through such pain. But Lewis encourages us to trust that God knows what He is doing. Just as the sculptor knows which parts of the stone must be removed to reveal the beauty within, God knows what aspects of our lives need to be refined and transformed. The process may be painful, but the end result is something far more beautiful than we can imagine. In moments of isolation, we might be tempted to fill the void with distractions, people, activities, or even unhealthy habits. But Lewis challenges us to resist this temptation and instead embrace our solitude as an opportunity to grow closer to God. He believed that these moments are invitations from God to seek Him more earnestly, to rely on Him more fully, and to trust in His plan for our lives. Moreover, Lewis understood that the loneliness we feel is not a sign of weakness or failure. Rather, it is a sign that God is at work in our lives, molding us into the people we are meant to be. He saw our loneliness as a crucible, a place where our faith is tested and strengthened, where we learn to depend on God in ways we might not have otherwise. This does not mean that loneliness is easy to endure. On the contrary, it can be one of the most challenging experiences we face. But Lewis reminds us that our struggles are not in vain. God's work in our lives is purposeful and intentional. He is not interested in simply making us comfortable, He is interested in making us holy. And sometimes, the path to holiness requires us to walk through seasons of loneliness. In conclusion, C.S. Lewis offers us a perspective that transforms our understanding of loneliness. Rather than seeing it as a punishment or a sign of God's absence, he encourages us to view it as a period of divine refinement. Just as an artist carefully and patiently sculpts a masterpiece from a block of stone, God is carefully and patiently working in our lives, using our loneliness to shape us into the people He has called us to be. It is in these moments of solitude that we can experience the deepest communion with God. That we can hear His voice more clearly, and that we can grow in our understanding of His purpose for our lives. So, when you find yourself in the midst of loneliness, take heart, God is at work, and He has a purpose for your solitude. Loneliness and pain, God's call to return to Him. C.S. Lewis, a profound Christian thinker, believed that the pain and loneliness we experience are not random afflictions, but tools used by God to draw our attention back to Him. These experiences, which can be deeply unsettling and painful, serve as reminders of the spiritual void within us, a void that can only be filled by God's presence. Lewis emphasized that this emptiness, rather than something to be feared or avoided, is a divine signal calling us back to the one relationship that can truly satisfy the deepest needs of our hearts. In his famous work, The Problem of Pain, Lewis describes how God uses suffering to break through the walls we build around our hearts. He famously wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." This quote reflects Lewis's belief that when we are comfortable and satisfied with our lives, we often forget about our dependence on God. It is only when we experience pain, whether it's physical suffering or the emotional weight of loneliness, that we are jolted out of our complacency and reminded of our need for Him. Lewis's insight into the role of pain and loneliness in our spiritual lives is rooted in the understanding that we are all created with an inherent longing for God. This longing is often masked or suppressed by the distractions of life, work, relationships, entertainment, and worldly pursuits. But when these distractions are stripped away, as they often are during periods of pain or isolation, we are confronted with the reality that nothing in this world can truly fill the emptiness in our souls. He described this emptiness as a God-shaped hole within each of us. The pain and loneliness we feel are not just random emotions, they are signals that we have been trying to fill that hole with things other than God. Lewis pointed out that we often attempt to fill this void with temporary pleasures, human relationships, material possessions, or even status. However, these things can never provide the lasting fulfillment we seek. God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from Himself, because it is not there. There is no such thing, Lewis wrote, reminding us that true joy and peace can only be found in a relationship with God. This is where loneliness becomes a spiritual tool. When we experience the absence of others or feel isolated, we are more likely to turn inward and seek solace. For Lewis, this turning inward is an opportunity for us to turn upward, to God. The loneliness we feel is, in many ways, an invitation from God to seek Him, to acknowledge that only He can fill the empty spaces in our hearts. It is through this longing, Lewis argued, that we are drawn closer to God and reminded of our dependence on Him. Lewis did not suggest that the process of filling this void is easy. In fact, he acknowledged that it is often painful and difficult. The loneliness we feel can be overwhelming, and the pain of feeling disconnected from others can lead us to question God's presence. But Lewis believed that it is precisely in these moments of questioning and struggle that we are most open to God's work in our lives. He likened God's work on our hearts to that of a sculptor chipping away at a block of stone. Each chip, though painful, reveals more of the masterpiece hidden beneath the surface. In the same way, our periods of pain and loneliness are part of God's process of shaping us into the people we are meant to be. In his book Mere Christianity, Lewis elaborated on this idea by saying, "The Christian does not think God will love us because we are good, but that God will make us good because He loves us." This transformation often involves periods of discomfort and loneliness, but it is ultimately for our good. The pain we experience is not a punishment, but a refining process, a way for God to remove the distractions and impurities in our lives so that we can become more like Him. Ultimately, Lewis's message is one of hope. Though loneliness and pain can feel overwhelming, they are not signs of God's absence. On the contrary, they are evidence of His active presence in our lives, calling us to return to Him and to recognize that only He can satisfy the deepest longings of our hearts. As we walk through these difficult seasons, we are invited to trust in God's plan and to believe that, in the end, the emptiness we feel will be filled, not by the temporary things of this world, but by the eternal presence of our Creator. Finding comfort in God, turning to Him in times of loneliness. C.S. Lewis, one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the 20th century, often spoke about the human experience of loneliness and how it serves as an invitation to seek God. For Lewis, the moments when we feel isolated and disconnected from others are not to be feared, but embraced as opportunities to draw closer to the only source of true comfort and peace, God Himself. In those quiet, lonely moments, Lewis believed we should turn to God, who alone can provide the deep joy and serenity we long for. In his book Mere Christianity, Lewis explains that our search for meaning and fulfillment in worldly things will ultimately leave us empty. No matter how many relationships we cultivate or possessions we acquire, the satisfaction they bring is temporary. If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world, he famously wrote. This quote illustrates Lewis's core belief that our hearts are ultimately restless until they find their rest in God. The peace we seek during our times of loneliness can only be found by turning to Him. Loneliness, in Lewis's view, is not a punishment or an indication that we are unloved. Instead, it is a reflection of our deeper spiritual hunger for connection with God. Lewis saw this hunger as evidence of our divine purpose. He described humans as being wired for eternity, meaning that we are made with a longing that only something infinite, God, can satisfy. When we experience isolation, it serves as a reminder that the fulfillment we seek cannot come from other people or material comforts, but from our Creator. For Lewis, this understanding of loneliness as a divine tool led to a profound shift in perspective. Rather than seeing loneliness as something to escape or avoid, he encouraged believers to view it as an invitation to deeper communion with God. In these moments of solitude, when the distractions of the world fade away, we are better positioned to hear God's voice and feel His presence. Look for yourself. And you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find Him, and with Him everything else thrown in, he once wrote. Here, Lewis points to the idea that when we seek God rather than trying to fill the void ourselves, we not only find peace but a sense of purpose and fulfillment that goes beyond our immediate circumstances. In times of loneliness, Lewis believed that prayer and meditation on Scripture are essential practices for turning our focus back to God. He wrote extensively about how regular prayer allows us to align our hearts and minds with God's will, reminding us that we are never truly alone. In prayer, we connect with the One who knows us better than we know ourselves. Lewis's own journey of faith, which included profound personal losses and struggles, led him to a deep conviction that God is always present, even in our darkest moments. He believed that it is through our relationship with God that we experience true peace, not the fleeting calm offered by worldly solutions. Furthermore, Lewis emphasized that the joy and peace we find in God are not dependent on our external circumstances. They are gifts that come from trusting in God's goodness and His plan for our lives. We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us, we are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be. Lewis once said, "This honest acknowledgement of the difficulties we face highlights the importance of seeking God's comfort in the midst of our struggles." Even when life is hard and loneliness feels overwhelming, Lewis believed that God's presence can bring a deeper joy than anything this world can offer. Ultimately, Lewis's message is one of hope. In our loneliness, we are reminded that our deepest needs and desires are not meant to be met by the world, but by God. By turning to Him in prayer, seeking His guidance, and trusting in His plan, we can experience the lasting joy and peace that only He provides. Though loneliness may persist for a time, it is never the final word. God's presence transforms it into an opportunity for deeper intimacy with Him and a greater understanding of His love. Loneliness as an opportunity, hearing God's voice and discovering our purpose. C.S. Lewis often spoke about the deeper meaning behind human experiences, including loneliness. Rather than viewing isolation as something purely negative, he saw it as an opportunity for spiritual growth and self-discovery. For Lewis, moments of loneliness are often moments when God is calling us to listen more closely to His voice, offering us the chance to deepen our relationship with Him and discover our true purpose in life. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis reflects on how pain and solitude can serve as a wake-up call from God. He famously wrote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. This profound insight helps us understand that the feelings of loneliness or isolation we experience are not arbitrary. They can be seen as a divine tool to draw our attention back to God. When distractions and noise are stripped away, we are left with the quiet where God's voice becomes clearer. Lewis believed that in those quiet, lonely moments, we are presented with an opportunity to evaluate our relationship with God. We might often seek comfort in relationships, material possessions, or accomplishments, but these things will eventually fall short. As Lewis pointed out in Mere Christianity, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. In other words, our longing for connection and purpose is not meant to be fulfilled by the world, but by God alone. Loneliness, therefore, can be a chance for us to realize this truth and turn our hearts toward Him. Rather than fearing loneliness, Lewis encouraged believers to embrace it as a chance for spiritual reflection. It's in these moments that we can better hear God's guidance, as there are fewer distractions pulling us away. Solitude provides the space for prayer, meditation, and a deeper understanding of God's will for our lives. Lewis's own personal experiences of loss and suffering brought him to this realization. He understood that while loneliness may feel painful, it can also serve as the beginning of a profound spiritual transformation. Lewis also believed that through our loneliness, we can discover our true purpose. In his view, we are created by God with a specific purpose in mind, and understanding this purpose requires that we listen carefully to His direction. In times of isolation, we may begin to question our current path or ask deeper questions about our lives. These questions, Lewis argued, are a natural part of our spiritual journey. By bringing these concerns to God in prayer, we allow Him to guide us toward the purpose He has for us. Ultimately, for Lewis, loneliness was not an obstacle but a doorway to greater spiritual intimacy and clarity. It's a moment where we are invited to draw closer to God and listen to His voice. Rather than seeking to fill the void with temporary distractions, Lewis urged believers to see these moments of solitude as opportunities to align with God's will and embrace the purpose He has designed for each of us. Through this process, we not only grow closer to God but also discover a deeper sense of fulfillment and peace. Trusting in God, placing our faith in the One who never fails. C.S. Lewis consistently urged believers to shift their trust away from temporary and imperfect things, whether people, material possessions, or worldly achievements, and to place their absolute faith in God. For Lewis, humans are inherently flawed and finite, while God is the only constant, unfailing source of love, wisdom, and fulfillment. It's a profound shift in perspective that he believed was essential for a fulfilling and meaningful life. In his book The Problem of Pain, Lewis pointed out that much of human suffering, disappointment, and heartache stems from misplaced trust. We are inclined to place our hopes and desires in people, careers, and the comforts of life, only to be let down. Don't let your happiness depend on something you may lose, he wrote. This simple yet powerful statement speaks to the fragility of relying on anything outside of God. Relationships can falter, wealth can disappear, and circumstances can change, but God's love and presence remain unwavering. Lewis emphasized that our trust in God must go beyond simply believing that He exists, it must transform how we live. In Mere Christianity, he wrote, faith, in the sense in which I am here using the word, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. Trusting God means holding firm to His promises, even when life feels uncertain or when we're tempted to look elsewhere for security. Lewis encouraged believers to recognize that God's plan is infinitely wiser than our own, even if it doesn't always align with our immediate desires or expectations. Part of trusting in God, according to Lewis, also means surrendering control. In our human nature, we often try to manage our own lives, solve our problems, and plan our futures. But as Lewis warned, this self-reliance can lead to disappointment and frustration. In The Weight of Glory, he wrote, relying on God has to begin all over again every day as if nothing had yet been done. This daily renewal of trust reminds us that we can't navigate life on our own. We need God's guidance and strength every step of the way. Lewis also understood that trusting in God doesn't mean we won't face hardships. In fact, he believed that struggles and challenges often serve as a means to deepen our faith. God wants us to learn to trust Him in the dark, he said. When we face difficulties, our faith is tested, and it's in these moments that we're called to lean even more heavily on God. Lewis believed that through trials, we come to a greater understanding of God's purpose and love for us. Ultimately, Lewis's message was clear: only God is truly dependable. He is the one constant in a world full of uncertainty and change. By placing our complete trust in Him, we free ourselves from the anxiety and disappointment that come from relying on imperfect things. As Proverbs 3 verse 5 reminds us, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. For Lewis, this was the essence of true faith, acknowledging our own limitations and trusting fully in the one who never fails.